Hello, this is Taylor. As promised, today we're going to go over how to actually get a job in management consulting. Everything from what the interview is like and how to prepare for it, requirements that you'll need to get an interview in the first place, my experience getting the job, and some advice that I would give to someone who wants to break into this profession. You know the drill though. In exchange for this picture of Squirt from Finding Nemo, please incinerate the like button. And don't act like you're too old for Finding Nemo, okay? It's a great movie. If you're new here, by the way, my name's Taylor. I work for a large international consulting firm. I'm based in New York City, though I was born and raised in California. Irrelevant. And this is my first job out of undergraduate university. Okay guys, first section is what the interview and the interview structure is actually like, and then we'll go into more detail in just a little bit. So the interview to get a consulting job includes a combination of what is called a case interview, which takes quite a bit of preparation, and a fit-based interview. So what even is a case interview? Basically, your interviewer will present you with a business scenario, typically one where there's a problem like declining revenue or shifting consumer preferences for the business. Your job is to then create a framework for solving that business problem, ask follow-up questions to help guide your hypothesis on what you think is driving the problem, and ultimately to come up with a final recommendation for that business to remediate the problem. As you can imagine, preparing for the case interview takes quite a lot of practice, and we'll go over how to prepare shortly. Okay, and the other part of the interview that I mentioned is the fit-based questions. As the name suggests, these questions are really to help gauge how well you would fit in at the firm. We'll go over some of the most commonly asked ones in just a little bit. So typically you'll start out with a first round interview, which is a combination of the case interview and fit-based questions. And if they choose to advance you past the first round interview, you'll move on to what's either called a final round interview or super day, which will also be a combination of case interviews and fit-based questions. But for the final round interview, it's usually with someone higher up in the firm, typically a partner. Okay, now that we have a high-level overview of what the interview structure actually looks like, let's talk about some requirements that you'll need and some boxes you'll have to check to actually get an interview in the first place. Consulting firms recruit entry-level consultants while they're still in college. Generally, to get a job at a consulting firm, you will either have to, 1, have an internship at that firm the summer after your junior year and then receive a full-time offer at the end of your internship if you do a good job, or 2, recruit for a full-time position the fall of your senior year, which is what I did. A third, slightly less prevalent option that's still worth mentioning is to check out if the firm has any programs for diversity groups during your sophomore year. If you're eligible, that's also a great way to get your foot in the door early and learn about the firm, whether it's a 2-day program or an early internship the summer after your sophomore year. Okay, so that's step 1, be a college student. Great. Requirement number 2, you of course will need a resume, ideally one with a strong GPA, previous work/internship experience, and some solid extracurriculars. You'll likely also need to submit a cover letter for each firm that you apply to, which is one page where you outline your previous work and extracurricular experience and how you can leverage those experiences to succeed in a job at the firm to which you're applying. Now some more fluid requirements/non-requirements that you guys asked me on Instagram a couple weeks ago. A question that I get variations of all the time is, do you have to be a business major to get into consulting? Can engineers get into consulting? Can political science majors get into consulting? Etc. Here's my answer. I think that the reason so many consultants were business majors is by far more a matter of self-selection than anything. Meaning people who were business majors will naturally gravitate towards a job like consulting anyway, rather than it being because consulting firms really prefer to seek out business majors. So my point is that no matter what your major is, you can totally get a job in consulting. In fact, people with STEM backgrounds, so things like computer science, information technology, mathematics, data science, those people are actually becoming even more preferable for the job than business majors because they tend to bring more hard technical skills to the table. What you do need though, no matter what your major is a good story on why you want to go into consulting. I will even concede that humanities majors might need to have an extra compelling story on why they want to go into it because admittedly their area of focus is pretty different than the skills needed for a consulting job. Quick thumbs up break for Squirt, or for the video, if you like it. Another question I get pretty often is, do you have to be good at math? Specifically, I want to go into consulting, but I'm really shit at math. Is good at math a requirement? I covered this a bit in my last video where I talk more about the ins and outs of the job, like salary, hours, exit opportunities. Cue it up if you desire, but I'll repeat my answer and give a little more detail. Yes, I think it's important to have a fairly strong baseline competence at math, but again, more so for the case interview than for the job itself. The case interview is all mental math, so it helps to be good and quick at it. As for the job itself, I've never yet had to use very difficult math, but I would still say it helps to be fairly good at it because you are still dealing with numbers a lot. Beyond math, I get a lot of questions about what's skills, both hard and soft skills, are needed to be a consultant, but I really want to elaborate on that, so I'm going to make a dedicated video on it. Subscribe and hit the Taylor bell notification so you don't miss it. Another requirement question I got was, do I need to go to a top uni? How about 2 years at community college and then transfer to a 4-year? I'll save you from my long-winded answer on this and give you the too long didn't read response. No, you do not have to go to a top university. Going to a top one helps you get your foot in the door for sure, because consulting firms recruit heavily from top schools. But the flip side of the coin there is that there is very stiff internal competition at those top schools because consulting firms will only take so many Ivy League students. This was my experience, by the way. I am one of said Ivy League students, and it felt nearly impossible sometimes to get one of those jobs because I was up against my very qualified peers. So if you don't go to a top university, it might be a little more difficult to get your foot in the door since consulting firms won't recruit there as heavily. But again, if you have a solid GPA, good work and internship experiences, and some solid extracurriculars, plus a compelling story on why you want to go into consulting, it is absolutely possible. And yes, this includes folks who started 2 years in community college and then transferred to a 4-year university. Final requirement question, do you need an internship at the same firm to go into consulting post-grad? No, you don't. I'm an example. I did 2 finance internships before recruiting full-time for consulting. However, whatever internship you do will ideally have some transferable skills for a consulting job. Alrighty, next section is preparation for the case interview. Lots of questions on this, so please buckle up for safety. I've decided to take a who, what, when, where, why, how approach because we want to be as me-see as possible, which means mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. Okay, enough of that. Starting with what, I'm gonna read you 2 short sample case interviews so you can actually get a flavor for what it might look like. So your interviewer will read a case interview like this one, during which you will furiously scribble down notes as quickly as you can. You don't have to right now, but in the real thing you would. All right, our client is Fashion Co., a player in the women's fashion market. It's been in the industry for a long time, but has experienced declining revenues each year for the past 5 years. Fashion Co. wants to understand what is causing this decline and what can the organization do to drive revenue. The interviewer will probably read it a little bit slower than that so you have time to get some notes down, but that is a pretty realistic example of what a case could look like. Okay, and another quick example. Our client is a major hotel chain. They are considering acquiring an existing hotel in Tulsa, Oklahoma for $20 million and expect an ROI of 20% over 3 years, should they make the investment. So that is what a case interview could sound like. Now moving on to how, and this is the thickest section, so please buckle up, I don't want to have to ask you again. Tips on how the fudge muffins to even approach something like this. I would start by simply watching a mock case interview on YouTube so you can see what it actually looks like. I will link the one down below in the description that I thought was the most helpful and most realistic. After that, I wholeheartedly believe that the best way to learn is by doing. Grab a friend by the arm and start casing each other. Where to even get these cases, you ask? There are tons of valuable mock case interviews online. Also, your college is very likely to have its own kind of case interview documents that students share amongst each other, so definitely look into that. There are also simulations online where you can case yourself, but I found it much more beneficial to case with a real person in front of me because then I got used to feeling a little pressure, getting a little flustered, and how to deal with that. Additionally, there are a lot of really good case interview books out there, the most popular one being called Case in Point. Did I read it? No, I did not. I read excerpts of it online, and there's definitely some value in there, don't get me wrong. That's just not the approach that I took. There's also this guy online named Victor Chang. He's a former McKinsey consultant, and he's got a ton of good free resources online, so I will link his website below. Once you do enough case interviews, you'll get into the groove of how they actually flow. 2 final how tips that I think go hand in hand. I do think it is possible to overcase. Yes, of course, I think you should do as many as you need to feel comfortable, but at some point you can burn out and just stop thinking straight. Now, it's a really subjective line to draw in the sand. I can't tell you exactly how many cases I think you should do before you burn out, but just keep this in mind. And the final tip in the section, and I think it's an important one, it is that once you have a framework for approaching problems that works well for you, I would advise you to stick to it for the most part. Yes, while every case is a little bit different, you can pretty much bet your bottom dollar that it's going to involve some profit metrics, some information about the overall market, such as if the problem is business specific or if it's industry wide, consumer preferences, there's a lot of different things there, and then sort of a grab bag of additional considerations that you'll want to take into account. So yes, you'll need to tailor your framework a bit depending on the case, but from personal experience, there was one point where I was using a framework that worked pretty well for me for a long time, and then for whatever reason, I tried a totally different method, and honestly, I got worse at casing because of it. So keep an eye out for this pitfall. Okay, moving on to who. Who should you case with? Ideally, choose friends who you know will give you honest feedback. I cased with a few people in college who, for whatever reason, I just didn't feel super comfortable giving very honest advice with, or vice versa. So just keep that in mind because you want every case you do to count. Definitely try to get some variety, case with a few different people, not just one person, so you can get used to different interviewing tones and styles. styles. As for when, some tips on when you're doing these preparation case interviews. Do your best to try to ignore the fact that it's gonna feel a little embarrassing and weird when you're doing these case interviews with your friends. Because ideally, you try to case as realistically as you would during the real thing, which means you put on a little bit of a face when you're asking follow-up questions and just in the way you carry yourself. So it definitely feels a little weird at first, but again, my advice would be to try to simulate it as close to the real thing as possible so you get the best possible feedback from your friend that you're doing it with. Also, you are bound to mess up the math sometimes or just get a little flustered if you feel like you're not getting to the right answer for the case. So practice composure. One thing interviewers definitely look at is how well you stay composed and how quickly you can turn a new leaf after you've messed something up. This is especially important because, believe it or not, even if you get to the totally wrong answer or you mess up some math during the case, that is not an end-all be-all. The interviewers actually really cared to see just how you think about the problem, how you talk through it and show your work, basically how you would be as a coworker if you were actually, their colleague. Another part of when is when to start preparing. I started preparing, I think, about a month and a half before my first interviews, partially because you'll simply need a decent amount of time to prepare, but also because you're doing this while you're in school, while you're in classes and taking exams and other extracurriculars and time commitments that you have. So you very likely will need to allow some wiggle room. Okay, we have where and why left. Starting with where are the interviews? All of my interviews were pre-COVID, so every single one was in person. I assume that they're virtual now, which is unfortunate because I personally like to make a first impression on someone in person, but at least everyone is on the same playing field. And why? Why is the case interview even a thing? If I may insert my opinion here, of course I can, this is my video. Now that I've been at the job for 9 months now, I actually do not think that the case interview is necessarily the best way to test candidates for the skills that they will actually need on this job. Now, I don't want to expend brainpower to propose what I think is a better solution right now. But yeah, that is my opinion now that I've been on the inside and know what skills it actually takes to be good at the job. But I digress. My opinion aside, the case interview is designed to simulate what you would actually be doing on the job, so you can demonstrate that you have some business acumen and just the way that you think about problems. Finally, a word on the fit-based portion of the interview. I don't think I need to spend as long on this, but very typical ones that you'll get are like, walk me through your resume, why do you want to go into consulting, why do you want to work at this firm specifically, tell me about a time that you demonstrated leadership on a team, tell me about your strengths and weaknesses, typical questions that you would get in most interviews. Definitely have like 2 really good stories that you can tailor a little bit to answer a lot of different questions. Be ready to explain any single line or word on your resume, and just try to make it a conversation with your interviewer. Definitely practice these fit-based questions with your friends too, okay? Don't neglect it just because it's a little bit easier than the case interview. Partners at firms especially care about fit because they've been in the industry for so long that they know the kind of people that succeed and the kind of people that they enjoy working with. Okay, this section is on my experience. How this process went for me tactically, the internships and previous experience that I had, what I majored in college leading up to this experience, etc. So it all started in September 1997. JK, we won't start quite that far back, but I'll bring you through how this process looked for me. As I mentioned, I had 2 internships in finance before recruiting for consulting, one of them the summer after my sophomore year and the other one the summer after my junior year, which means that I took part in the full-time recruiting cycle the fall of my senior year. For those who know where I went to college and what I majored in, feel free to skip to this timestamp because Lord knows I'm a broken record. But for those who don't, and I do still get asked this question pretty often, I went to the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, which is one of the 8 Ivy League universities here in the United States. Specifically, I was in a dual degree program at UPenn called the Huntsman Program in International Studies and Business, where I got a degree from Wharton Business School in economics with concentrations in both business management and business operations, plus another degree in international studies from the College of Arts and Sciences. I say this because I get asked it a lot, but also just to give you a little bit of background on what I studied. But again, you do not have to be a business major or go to business school to get into consulting. So I started practicing case interviews in early September of my senior year. I actually sent in all my applications in September as well. And then all of my interviews started mid-October. This time frame is what's known, at least at Penn, as OCR, or on-campus recruiting. It's when firms come to Penn's campus to give interviews to the students whose applications they selected. And it's probably the most stressful 2 months that I and my peers went through during college. Unless you were lucky enough to enjoy your junior year internship and receive a full-time offer, those people are chilling senior year. So I applied to 5 consulting firms. I got first round interviews at 4 of them, and then final round / super days with 3 of them. All of the final round interviews took place at the respective firms' offices in New York City. So they paid to have me Amtrak from Philly up to New York City, stay in a hotel, and then do the final round interview the next morning. Some of the interviews went super well, where I feel like I nailed the case and just bonded really well with the interviewer. Some of them went okay, where I feel like I got to a pretty good solution by the end of the case interview and the fit questions went all right. And then there was one specifically where the fit part went well, like we bonded pretty well, but the case, I just bombed it. That case, I still remember to this day, I just thought was extraordinarily difficult, and yeah, it didn't go well. That's why you apply to multiple firms, because you never know what you're gonna get. Okay, final part, some advice for someone wanting to break into consulting. Most of my advice has already been sprinkled throughout this video. There are the obvious things like work hard in college to get a good GPA, take part in extracurriculars that you find interesting, make sure you give yourself enough time to prepare for the case interviews, have some really good stories and reasons why you want to go into consulting in the first place for the fit-based portion of the interview. Look ahead of time when applications are due for each consulting firm so you don't miss the deadline. That's mostly it, but I do have some advice on something I would caution you against. Please don't tailor your whole college experience or life around trying to get into consulting. I got a question on Instagram, and this is totally real. What tips would you give to a 13-year-old who wants to do management consulting? My advice to you, enjoy middle school, little man, and please ask me again in 9 years when you actually have to start thinking about this. Seriously though, I would not advise choosing extracurriculars solely around if you think they will look good for consulting firms, because it's honestly just not necessary. Choose ones that you want to do and the ones that you find most interesting. Consultants are generally pretty well-rounded people, I have found, with widely different interests, which of course I think is a great thing. All right, let me know what other consulting topics or videos you guys would want to see here in the near future. And before you head out, you know the drill. And subscribe so you don't miss future videos. I'll see you guys soon. Bye.